Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for another in that spell-binding series, Bookshelf Essentials, which is based on a series of videos that the great David Wiley has been doing, and now some other booktubers have been doing it also, along with David Wiley, where we talk about very special books in our personal libraries, books that are essential to our libraries, books that we would never want to live without, and so we will always keep them always. And today I'm going to be talking about 7 science fiction novels of H.G. Wells. 7 science fiction novels of H.G. Wells. Now, this is a collection of novels by H.G. Wells, and this collection of novels has actually been collected several times over the years in different editions. The one I have up on my bookshelf right now is this one. This is titled The War of the Worlds and Other Novels, but it is those same 7 science fiction novels of H.G. Wells that have been reprinted so many times. This is published by Barnes & Noble. It's my extra fancy pants edition, which I have up on the shelf. I really like the cool space age cover, even though that illustration has nothing to do with any of the stories in this volume, really. I guess you could stretch it for War of the Worlds, but the ships didn't look like that in War of the Worlds. And that isn't Mars anyway. No, that illustration doesn't really fit any of the stories in this book. Now, the way I originally encountered these novels of H.G. Wells was in this beat up old volume. And this one is really beat up because I've had this since I was a little kid. 7 science fiction novels of H.G. Wells. This was a hardcover published by Dover. It used to have a dust jacket, I'm sure, although this edition never has had one since I've owned it. I'm sure since it was Dover that the dust jacket was probably almost as boring looking as this. But I love this volume. This is one of the books in my library that I have a great affection for. This used to belong to my stepfather. And my stepfather was a guy who read a lot. He read a lot. And he probably had the most influence on me as far as being a reader is concerned, because he had all kinds of cool books. And he had this cool book. And many of those really cool books that he had, I stole. And he let me steal them because he was a cool guy like that. But I stole this from my stepfather. And to even more scandalously, not only did I steal it, I put my little child name in here. That's Mike Vaughan, written by little child me. You know, as if it didn't belong to him and not me. But, you know, I stole it and put my own name in it when I was a little kid. And this is how I originally read the 7 science fiction novels that have been reprinted so many times. These 7 science fiction novels in this volume are The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, The War of the Worlds, The First Men in the Moon, The Food of the Gods, and In the Days of the Comet. And this particular edition originally belonged to the Pinole Valley High School library. I'm hoping he just got this at a library sale and didn't just, take it home from high school and he just never brought it back. That's possible. I could get in a lot of trouble with this book, but yeah, those are the 7 science fiction novels of H.G. Wells, and those are also the novels that you will see reprinted over and over again. Here they all are on the back of the Fancy Pants edition of this book. Those are the novels that you will see reprinted over and over again in individual volumes as well. Now, when I originally encountered these stories in this volume, I those were, of course, the first H.G. Wells novels that I read. And for years, I didn't know that he had written any others. And he wrote a lot. H.G. Wells wrote many, many books. Fortunately, because we live in the day and age that we do, if you have an e-reader, you can get everything practically. You can get everything practically that he wrote. Almost all of it you can get for free. Or if you want to get some giant collection, you can for like a couple bucks. Because, all that stuff's in the public domain. And so now, we have access to all of these novels that have been out of print for decades, right? Because for the longest time, the only novels you could read from H.G. Wells, for the most part, aside from a few of his social novels, were these. And when these were originally collected, they didn't have everything science fiction that H.G. Wells wrote. The Sleeper Awakes is not in here. Having read that recently, I'm not surprised because it's not one of his best books, that's for sure. War in the Air is not in here, and I've never read that book. I'm due to read that book. There were a few, and for the longest time, this is how I knew H.G. Wells. And they're just, of course, they're fantastic. The Time Machine, the greatest time travel story of all time. Really fun kind of adventure into the future with a very unprepared time traveler. If you're going to go travel like thousands of years into the future, you should bring some stuff. Bring some stuff. Bring a snack. Bring a flashlight. Bring some things like that, because he ran into trouble. Our time traveler did. And I always wondered about the time machine. So the time machine is like this machine that you kind of get on. It's like this framework. The best version of the time machine was in the original Time Machine film. You should watch that movie. Anyway, so he just travels on this time machine into the future. And I always wonder, what if you, set your time machine for a time where there's a building right where you're, arriving? What if you arrive right like in a wall? Or what if there's a big pit or something where your house used to be, there's lots of dangers, traveling through time. And I remember thinking that even as a kid, I was like, hey, what if this happened? But, those mishaps never happened to our time traveler. He must have figured out a way around those. Then we've got The Island of Dr. Moreau, which I've talked about before a couple times, I think, which is a science fiction novel, but it's just a really amazing horror novel, really, with a mad scientist who experiments on animals to turn them into quasi-human creatures, human-like creatures. And it's just really, really good. I think it's one of my favorites. I'm not sure it is my favorite. The Time Machine might be my favorite, but that might be more for sentimental reasons because, of course, it was the first story of his that I had read. But, man, The Island of Dr. Moreau is so good. Really good. Then we've got The Invisible Man, which is really good, but it's not one of my favorites. But it's a really good book, The Invisible Man, about the Invisible Man. You know all about the Invisible Man. You've probably watched that. No, you probably probably haven't seen the old black and white movie because, I'm old and that's why I've seen it. Then The War of the Worlds, which has been filmed a few times now. But the book is excellent, where you have Martians arriving in Victorian England. And yeah, they kick ass, the Martians do. Until they are, spoiler alert, they're defeated by something. The Martians are. But it's really an interesting novel. Again, The War of the Worlds has a lot of parts in it that are straight up horror. There are just some great, terrifying moments in War of the Worlds. Really good book, War of the Worlds. One of his best, definitely, if not his best. The First Men in the Moon is interesting. The moon, by the way, is hollow and there are monsters inside. Just so you know. They probably weren't aware. There are monsters inside the moon. A whole Lovecraftian society of monsters are inside the moon. This is an interesting book because it does manage to balance comedy, adventure, and horror. And it does it well. This book does that really well, and that's hard to do. And I've seen that kind of thing fail often. But The First Men in the Moon manages that really well. It's an excellent book. I think The First Men in the Moon, I think that book is as good as the other 4 novels I just mentioned. I think it's every bit as good as those. Then there's The Food of the Gods. Now, I remember being disappointed when I read The Food of the Gods when I was a kid because I was familiar with it from that terrible movie with the giant rats and the giant bugs, which I haven't seen for years. I'm going to have to see that movie again, which had to have been produced in the 70s, right? The Food of the Gods. I literally haven't seen that movie since the 80s. Now I have to see it. But, it had giant critters in it. And so this book is not very much like that movie. And it actually is my least favorite of the novels in this collection. But In the Days of the Comet is really interesting, which is the final novel in these 7 science fiction novels. It's a really interesting book, full of his social ideas and his utopian hopes. It's not as good as most of the other books in this collection, but really interesting and certainly worth reading In the Days of the Comet. I'll hold up this now because this is my favorite version of this because it's the one I read when I was a little kid. I probably will reread these probably in this volume later this year. Probably in December. Let's think a year from now. If I had thought ahead, I might have read these this year. But yeah, a year from now, I'll probably be ready to pick up this volume again. And I always will be ready to pick up this volume. H.G. Wells, such a remarkable and interesting writer who wrote so many different things, always looking ahead to the future, had a wonderful imagination, very concerned about our species. He had kind of a grim outlook, I think, at the end. I think he was disillusioned by us humans and how we were always killing each other and stuff like that. And I perfectly understand that. I understand why he felt that way. These books are just fabulous, though. They're just fantastic science fiction fantasies, early science fiction, written at a time when science fiction wasn't even a thing, really. So 7 science fiction novels of H.G. Wells, all of the stories in this volume I highly recommend. And if you want them all together, you could find a bunch of different volumes with all of these novels in them. They've been collected over and over again over the years. So I will shut up now. I will catch you next time.